Hi, this week I want to talk about not just what it means to be Christian, but what it means to be distinctly Christian. Now, if you're like most of the people I've talked to about this topic, you may be wondering what could possibly be meant by distinctly Christian that's more than just Christian. And so I want to share with you the story about how I came to make this distinction in the first place. When I was in seminary, I had to read a book, and the author was talking about how one Sunday morning they were just struck by the songs that they were singing that morning and how they were so very much not Trinitarian in character. Now, that's not to say that they were denying the Trinity or being anti the Trinity, but simply that there was very little in the lyrics of the songs that made it clear that we worshiped a God who was triune. Now, I must admit that I had really never given that much thought before. I made the assumption that probably many other people have made, and that is, well, of course we're singing to the Trinity. That's what we believe. Just because we don't always say it doesn't mean that it's not true. Now, what the author was trying to say is that it may not be that big of a problem if any particular song is not Trinitarian in nature. It can become a problem, though, if that's the trend of the songs that we're singing. Because you see, people have a tendency to believe more of what they sing than what it is that they hear and even what they have read. And so over time, if most of the songs we sing are not Trinitarian in any meaningful sense, then that will over time have an impact on what people believe. Now, the same author pointed out that by far the most common way the worship songs that he was analyzing referred to God was as you, or as you, Lord. Now, every once in a while, this you would be fixed by a reference to who Jesus was, but most of the time it was just you, and this you was maybe loving or maybe mighty, but we didn't really know much based on the song as to who this God really is. Well, it happened, interestingly enough, that the very day after I was reading this, I attended a college worship service. Now, it was kind of the kickoff for the new year, and so there wasn't really a whole lot of teaching. It was just mainly music, and we sang like 10 different songs that night, and I was struck, because I'd just been reading this, that only one of them had any sense that we worshiped a God who wasn't just a random you, Lord. I think that's when I started to really take it seriously and realize there was something to this observation. And so I started paying attention to the words we sing in the worship songs. I was part of a retreat shortly after this where we didn't necessarily project the words onto a screen. And so the song leaders would make up these songbooks ahead of time with all the songs that we might sing. And so I kind of went through there and I was trying to highlight which of these songs implied something like a Trinity or even leaned in that direction and which ones didn't. And it was very interesting to discover that very few of them had any Trinitarian dimension whatsoever. Now, I want to make sure I'm being very clear. I wasn't trying to be unreasonable. I wasn't trying to say the only songs that count are ones that specifically name Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in some way. I was really just looking for anything that implies something more than just the you, Lord. So a song that focused on Christ specifically, maybe his work on the cross, was going to be much better than a song that just talked about you, Lord, and vague terms about love and power. And so because of all this, I started referring to some of the songs we sing as being distinctly Christian. And what I mean by that is that they're the kinds of songs that if you removed the actual life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus from the picture, they simply wouldn't make any sense at all. And this has the surprising result of saying that there are many songs that are Christian in the sense that they were written by Christians, they were written for Christians to sing in the context of a Christian worship service, and yet they're not distinctly Christian because they make no reference to Jesus, even a passing one, at all. One example of this kind of thing might be the classic hymn, All Creatures of Our God and King, because there's no reference to Jesus at all in there. And so someone could reject the core of the gospel that in Jesus God has come to be with us and still sing that song. It's interesting, it also applies to classic hymns like How Great Thou Art. Now, there are some other hymns that at least do a little bit better. They at least lean in the direction, even if they're not as clear as they might be. The song Amazing Grace, doesn't mention Jesus as such, but at least it's talking about grace, which is a more or less distinct Christian viewpoint and is talked about in pretty traditional Christian language. Also, the hymn, It Is Well With My Soul, references Satan. And while Satan is certainly not the same thing as Jesus, Satan tends to find his home conceptually within Christian theological thinking. And so it's at least implying and kind of alluding to Christianity, even if it isn't actually as clear as it might be. Now, by contrast, there's hymns like The Old Rugged Cross that pretty deliberately and frequently draws our attention back to what Jesus has done on the cross and what that means for us. Now, I want to make sure I'm being very clear that to say something is either Trinitarian or not Trinitarian is not the same thing as saying whether it's a good song or a bad song. One of the things I had to come to terms with is that I've never really loved the song Shine, Jesus, Shine, but I also have to admit the fact that it is explicitly Trinitarian in a way that not all that many songs are. Now, so far, I've been focusing mainly on the songs that we sing in the church. And while I definitely think we should be singing more distinctively Christian songs so that we're not training ourselves into believing over time that maybe God isn't a triune or they've fallen into what they've called classical theism, this concern about being distinctly Christian shows up in other ways too. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was absolutely not talking about what it means to be distinctly Christian, he wrote at one point, he said, "A wheel that can be turned, although nothing else moves with it, is not part of the mechanism." Now, he was talking mostly about language and how our words get used, but it can be revealing to us as well, because if we have a song and we can sing it equally well, whether Jesus really did come to be with us, and if the gospel is true or if the gospel is not true, then it could be many things. It may even have a place in the church, but the one thing it's not is distinctly and clearly Christian. I want to reiterate the fact that something being not distinctly Christian is not the same thing as saying that it is non-Christian or even anti-Christian. For example, the Psalms were a huge influence on a lot of the songs, the hymns, and the songs we sing today, and being from the Old Testament, there's no way they can be explicitly Christian, and yet there's still a role for them to play in the church. My point is that if most of the songs we sing are not distinctly Christian, it means that most of the songs we sing do not rely on the very core of our faith, and that cannot help but have an impact on how we think and what we believe over time. So one thing I found to be very helpful when I think about things this way is to ask the question, what does the incarnation tell us about this? And sometimes the answer is, it tells us a lot. If we start our thinking about love of God and about the seriousness of sin, and we start from what we see in Jesus, it really can be very illuminating into how we think. Sometimes, though, if we don't start by asking that question of what does the incarnation have to say about all of this, we may find ourselves starting first with the question, starting first with the topic, and only afterwards trying to put Jesus into it. And so we may start to find that we're not thinking along the lines of Jesus. And so we either need to go back and rethink things through the lens of Jesus, or else we need to at least acknowledge the fact that Jesus really isn't the core of our thinking in this case. Now, I realize this is almost certainly a hard pill to swallow for many people. I've gotten a lot of pushback on this topic over the years. There seems to be a huge temptation to try to speak to people in the name of reaching them where they are, so they want to talk about God's love or God's grace or other topics like that without actually referencing the actual Jesus side of our belief. And the idea seems to be that if we can talk to people and if we can convince them of God's love and God's grace and God's mercy without necessarily having to bring in all this Christian language, then perhaps we'll be able to convince them of all this without receiving the same resistance that we sometimes get from people to Christians in our world today. The only problem is, if we talk to them and we convince them about the love of God and the mercy of God without any reference to Jesus and what Jesus has done, have we actually convinced them of the love of God that we actually believe in as Christians? If we've convinced somebody that God loves them, but we don't have to talk about Jesus to do it, have we actually convinced them to be a Christian, or have we just turned them into somebody who likes love? And who doesn't like love? I know that sometimes when I talk about this topic, I can come off as being a little bit narrow in my thinking, and people sometimes might feel like I'm trying to micromanage what we can sing and what we say. That's not my goal, and I hope I don't come off that way in this video. My real goal is to simply draw attention to the fact that what we say and the way we say it really does matter. That if we systematically avoid answering a question, it's possible that we don't really believe it, and that we should always make sure to make our core convictions really central to everything that we say and do. Now, I'm not so naive as to think that anybody's going to wake up tomorrow morning and suddenly just start to think the way that I do. My only hope is that if you're watching this, you will take just even a little bit of your time and a little bit of your energy and pay some attention to what you say and how you say it and how that shapes your belief. And that if you discover that most of what you say and think isn't distinctly Christian, you would at least take some steps to maybe move in that direction. Well, that's all I have for this week. If you have any questions or topics you'd like me to take up, please send me an email at pastorstevik@gmail.com. If you find these videos interesting or helpful in some way, please consider liking and sharing them on the various social media platforms. And if you'd like to subscribe to the YouTube channel where these videos are posted, it's youtube.com/tstevik1. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.